And I don't think we should expect Mr. Trump to be frank with us about his plans for tariffs any more than we would expect a finance minister to be frank with us about the possibility of a currency devaluation. This is a degree of authority I don't think any American president has sought since Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House. One common thread is the attempt to use these tariffs to wean countries away from economic relations with China. As Europe became richer, there's absolutely zero reason why the United States should be paying a disproportionate share of European defense. We should care, I think, about German security. Speaking as an American, I believe that it is in our interest. But it is also the case that it can't be more in our interest than it is in Germany's.
Well, thank you again very much indeed for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's great to be here, John.
Now, obviously, we're recording this on the 8th of April, and I say that because we'll go to air as soon as possible. But the scene is changing so rapidly that just to contextualize it, we have the great tariff Trump dumps, as they're being called in the Australian media, and at this precise moment, there's the threat from President Trump to increase the tariffs on China by a further 50% if the Chinese continue with their retaliatory tariffs. And an Australian economist, a very respected economist, believes that this may, in fact, apart from anything else, add very significantly to inflation and a drop in GDP in America because of the potential increased cost of imports. Can I get you to sort of open up on what you think the president's objectives are here, whether they might work, what it will do to the Western alliance, and how China might respond? Big issues, I know, but you will have done a lot of thinking about it.
All right. Well, those are some pretty big and searching questions. And I think one of the things that we all have to remember is that trying to read President Trump's mind is a challenging exercise. He clearly has strong intuitions, but he does not necessarily tell you everything that's on his mind. And sometimes I think he lets himself be guided by, as perhaps we all do, but to a lesser extent, his own sort of prejudices or intuitions, if you will. And so one has to kind of look at his actions and try to piece together a theory of what is on his mind and how he's acting at any particular time. And as I look at the mix of his actions, both at home and abroad, including very much these tariffs, what I see is someone who is doing everything possible to concentrate power into his hands. If we just look on the international side of that, what we can see is there are really two things that the United States provides that for dozens of countries around the world are really indispensable. One of them is security guarantees, whether it's NATO or other treaties that we have with countries like Australia and Japan. Another is the access to the U.S. market, the largest and richest consumer market in the world. What Trump has done to a remarkable degree is he's asserted personal control over both of those things. So that in Europe, when people think about the treaty with the NATO treaty, which in theory, perhaps in law, provides some kind of an assurance of American support in the event of a Russian or other invasion, Trump has made it pretty clear that whether or not he will either honor or not honor that treaty based on his priorities. And we see that in the case of where he's threatened, at least rhetorically, to take Greenland from Denmark, and taking the territory of a treaty ally is an unorthodox step, can we say? So, and then on this tariff issue, what he's done with a basis in U.S. law that is strongly contested by many legal scholars, but nevertheless for now seems to be holding, is that he can personally set tariffs regardless of whether it's the rules of the World Trade Organization or any bilateral treaty. He can set tariffs at whatever level on whatever product he chooses at any given moment for whatever reason. Which means that if for any leader in the world, or any business owner in the world for that matter, you need to go to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and knock very politely on the door and ask to see Mr. Trump, to see if Mr. Trump can help you with your problem. This is a degree of authority I don't think any American president has sought since Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House during the height of World War II. And it really is an extraordinary series of steps. You'll hear a lot of people talking about how Trump is a bumbler, an amateur, a stupid person who doesn't know what he's doing. And you and I might both disagree with him strongly on whether things like tariffs are as beneficial as he is at least asserting. Nevertheless, this is to have accomplished this less than 3 months from your inauguration is a record of accomplishment, for good or for ill, that I think it would be difficult to match, certainly in American history. Now we ask ourselves, why is he doing this? What does he hope to accomplish? Both excellent questions. And I think the fact that China has been the country that has received the greatest increases in tariff and the largest number of threats tells us something here about what he's doing. President Trump clearly does not think the world is in a good place. And I think many observers around the world would agree with him on that, even if they agree with him on nothing else. That is, the international system that emerged after the Second World War and which further developed after the fall of the Soviet Union. Some people call it the rules-based world order, Rubio, rules-based international order, some the liberal international order, some the American international order, or even some the American empire. Whatever you want to call it, and whether you like it or dislike it, it is clearly on the rocks. It faces geopolitical challenges from China, from Russia, from Iran, though not quite so much from Iran as it did a year ago, and North Korea and others. It also faces kind of an internal fracturing among as public opinion in different parts of the world, very much including many European countries, has shifted away from some of the ideas that it supports. It suffers from institutional breakdown, most notably, I think, the complete collapse of the World Trade Organization, which has been essentially irrelevant to everything that's happened in the last few years. And I could go on. And so Trump, I think, rather than doing what President Biden attempted, which was to find a way to shore up that system, Trump seems to be looking past it to some new and as yet kind of unshaped, perhaps, international system, one in which international institutions and international law are weaker than they at least aspired to be under the rules-based international order. National sovereignty is protected. I should also add, by the way, that when the Trump administration and many of its supporters look at this crisis of the rules-based order, they look at internal crises among the Western liberal democracies. One of them would be, what we experience is essentially open borders in the United States in the Biden years, with mass illegal migration across our southern frontier. In Europe, you've seen waves of migration where many Europeans now begin to wonder whether their countries will still be their countries as time goes on, so on and so forth. And then aligned with that is a kind of what I think the people like Vice President Vance would say would be a kind of a mental, moral, and spiritual failure on the part of the elites in the Western world, where they fail to perceive these threats and focused on sort of imaginary threats or visionary threats, or say on the issue of climate change, a real threat perhaps, but one where the various efforts and programs that they initiated had little to no chance of actually dealing with the problem that concerned them. So a sort of a displacement and an abdication of elites. The root problem that people like Vance would identify would be, I think, that the loss of national sovereignty as a moral value, as well as a political fact, led to a kind of a weakening of the bonds that make a political society coherent and develop a leadership that is focused on the concrete problems of the people in that society. And so they came to see this international order, this cosmopolitan system, this globalism, not merely as a good idea perhaps in its day, but whose time has passed, but is actually a source of many of the problems that people were experiencing in their own societies. And so they see themselves as engaged in a kind of an existential struggle to regain sovereignty in the United States, and they hope other countries to regain sovereignty as well, as a way of kind of re-anchoring politics. At least as far as I can tell, this is the vision that drives them. And they would say that the globalization of trade and the globalization, frankly, of finance that accompanies it were important elements in creating this post-national universe that again, in their view, is unsustainable. So they see the Trump's trade policy not simply as a way to try to rebalance the American trade accounts so that our trade deficits are smaller and our surpluses are larger, but as a way to strike at this globalized system that is, in their view, kind of strangling and corrupting the national life of the Western peoples.
So major implications for America's allies, for China, but also for America itself. So if we could come to America itself, I mean, traditionally the view of tariffs has been get them down, open up trade. To some extent, I think you'd have to say that the attempts to achieve a better global trading environment have been prostituted by China, and we might come to that in a moment. But in the short term, if the traditional sort of economic view is right, this will damage the American economy, at least in the short term. It'll push up inflation. It may dry up growth. Is it your view that this will result in enormous political tensions in America? You know, Republicans in particular looking to their own support base if inflation starts to damage the economy, if there's pressure upwards again on interest rates, those sorts of factors?
Yeah, well, I think we can certainly imagine that if the Trump tariffs go forward exactly as they were scheduled as of 5 minutes before our podcast, that there'll be all kinds of disruptions. And I think it'll manifest not simply in inflation, where the price of something goes up, but quite possibly shortages where spare parts that you need to keep your Korean car are not available because of various kinds of disruptions. I have to think that the passage of goods through ports is going to be affected by this. And So some things that you count on won't be there or won't be there in time. And that will have, those consequences will ricochet through supply lines and retail outlets and so on and so forth. That will help drive an inflation. In general, protectionism does indeed, in my view, sort of, abstract, considered as an abstract matter, it does reduce economic efficiency. And that does reduce, all things being equal, GDP. And that reduces living standards, at least measured in currency terms. And if we try to understand what the Trump people hope or expect out of all of this, and maybe I'm assuming that our listeners are more interested in trying to understand Trump than understanding Walter Mead's personal views on this or that aspect of Trump policy. They'll be happy to share them. I think they would say several things. One is, yes, the costs of transition are real. President Trump has already said this, as have many of the people around him, but so are the costs of remaining with the status quo. And here they would talk about the effect on communities that have been hollowed out by the globalization of industry. They would talk about the ease with which substances like fentanyl are imported, so that young people, and maybe in particular young men who no longer have a career path open to them in manufacturing or other well-paid jobs, are sort of especially vulnerable to seeking satisfaction in drugs, that the effects on crime, on families that don't get started, homes that fall apart, those costs, which are not necessarily measured on the same scale as an accountant's measurement of inflation, those costs are real and very high. And so that they would argue there's a cost of delaying this process. They would also, I think, say, in terms of, and you'll hear a lot of economists talk, and they're right about it, they'll talk about distortions that if you start essentially raising a lot of government revenue from imported goods, or at least try to do that, this is going to create all kinds of perverse incentives, lead to distorted economic outcomes. And here, one can hardly argue with it. This seems correct. I think the Trump people would respond at that point, and what do you think the current income tax system does in the United States with an income tax code that is so long that no human being has ever read it in full, or certainly none has ever understood it in full, that is crammed with the accumulation of 100 years of gifts to special interests and lobbyists, complexity building on complexity, whole industries shaped by tricks of accounting and tax loopholes, that if you could reduce the burden of income tax even partially by transferring it to tax, would it be the case that the net distortion of government raising revenue on the economy would grow? And they would argue you have to compare the two rather than simply looking at the costs of protection in isolation. And I think that's a fair point. I would not call myself enough of an economist to give any sort of reading on, how do you measure those things? But I think just considered in the abstract, they have a point.
There are very important issues, as I would be seen, I think, by people as somebody who's been broadly in favour of trade reform, of reduction of tariffs and what have you. But it is troubling if you look, you've alluded to it, and J.D. Vance talks a lot about it, that hollowing out of communities, and in particular, the estimated 10 to 20 million American men who have drifted into, despair, loss of hope, depression, abuse, because there's not a role for them. So these things are the troubling downsides of economic reform. And then there is the problem, I think, too, of the wealthy becoming a wealthier than ever, think Tech Valley, while many other communities live in circumstances where the young people don't seem to have much of an economic future. The question becomes one, as I think you've alluded to as well. Nobody else has been able to come up with ideas to really tackle these problems, and the status quo had to be broken. So we are in uncharted waters, but one can see why there's a drive for what I think President Trump himself has called unpleasant medicine.
Yes, I think you're right. That begs the question of whether this is the exact medicine. Just because something is unpleasant doesn't mean it will cure you. But I think we can't evaluate what the president is doing or trying to do without understanding the backdrop that while I think for the establishments in both Republican and Democratic parties, they argued and believed that the status quo is working for the world, working for the United States, working for the American people. Yes, a few problems here and there, but on the whole, the status quo is your friend, versus the perception that carried Trump into office, but also animated, for example, people who support Bernie Sanders in American politics, that the status quo is broken in some way and needs aggressive measures to be fixed. It was fascinating that in the November 2024 election, President Trump actually contributed to a lessening of racial polarization, in the sense that he ran better among Hispanic voters and Black voters than Republicans have in recent years. To some degree, that's been replaced by a gender polarization, where Trump ran very strongly with men and much less strongly with women. Then I think in another interesting set of polls, he seemed to be much more popular with the younger generation. And, our classic sort of, we political observers have a kind of working assumption that young people are more liberal than old people, and you tend to get more conservative as you get older. Trump seems, at least temporarily, to have reversed that dynamic in the United States. So it's something big is happening here. And I often compare our times, and I may have even done this before on this podcast, but compare the times we're living through to the peak years of the Industrial Revolution, when technological change and economic change was upending the sort of social contracts and challenging the political institutions, so that even in a country with the long stability of Great Britain, you had the Chartist movement and you had mass protests. In the United States, in the generation after the Civil War, we had almost a breakdown of government, in the sense that government was corrupt. Political parties were pretty ineffective. It's hard when you think back between the assassination of Lincoln in 1865 and the assassination of McKinley in 1901. It's very difficult to think of a great president or a great leader of any kind in that generation. But at the end of it, the United States emerged with the largest industrial economy in the world. A generation of failed government policy actually provided a space for the private sector to triumph. But you look at countries with less happy histories than Britain and the United States in the Industrial Revolution. What happened in Russia? What happened in Germany? What happened in so many other countries where revolutionary movements led to all kinds of political upheaval, terror, and other things. So if we're in an era, if the information revolution really is as big of a thing as the Industrial Revolution was in its time, and maybe bigger and happening faster, we would expect disruption to become the norm, something that rapid change that challenges the foundations of our political system is the kind of thing that happens normally in these eras of historical upheaval.
They're very useful insights. Can I ask you, before we move on to what all of this means for America's friends, like the country I'm from, presumably President Trump, as I don't think anybody disputes that he has an astute business mind, he's got an eye on that out of control American budgetary mess, 37 billion, a trillion in public sector debt, growing rapidly. He would like to reduce taxes. There's no room there. I assume he'd like to increase defence spending. That's hard to do when you're running those sorts of deficits. And he sees, rightly or wrongly, an income stream out of tariffs, which will take the pressure off that deficit and at the same time give him some wriggle room on personal taxation. I think you've alluded to this, but I take it that's a big part of his thinking.
It's certainly a subject to which he refers from time to time. I don't know, even if you listen to the kind of people speaking for the administration in the middle of our current tariff upheavals, you find some of them will tell you the goal is to, people like Elon Musk saying the goal would be to get to a 0-0 tariff regime. That the goal of all of that, and Trump's rhetoric in the past has pointed to this idea that reciprocity is the answer. That America has characteristically had lower tariffs. In some cases, this dates from the post-World War II era, where the United States consciously wanted to foster the recovery of Cold War allies in Europe and elsewhere, in order to create a solid social and economic base for the alliance and to keep them from falling into the communist zone. And then increasingly, as time went on, to promote the modernization and development of countries in the so-called global south, so that many countries do enjoy quite strong. It is, easier to import a Japanese car into the United States than an American car into Japan. So, so one interpretation of his trade policy is that the goal is to remove these things and to, trade on an equal footing, ideally at a low tariff level. Maybe. Or others in his entourage speak of the beauty of tariffs and the renationalization of economic life. So there are different views in the Trump world, and I believe actually these reflect differing views in Donald Trump, and that he can see advantages to play. He might be willing to play either of those games, and to some degree, making other people think he would be equally happy with either outcome would be one of the ways you'd use to try to steer them as a negotiator toward the position you might actually prefer. And I don't think we should expect Mr. Trump to be frank with us about his plans for tariffs any more than we would expect a finance minister to be frank with us about the possibility of a currency devaluation or something of that kind. There's some things that you cannot talk honestly about if you're in power.
If we could then move to what this means for America's friends, Australia certainly, I think, is a place that overwhelmingly the citizens value the relationship with America and look to America for leadership, including in terms of our security. But of course, you've seen massive shockwaves, particularly in Europe, as President Trump's insistence that America won't automatically be there for them. And to some extent, as one of our most experienced writers, Greg Sheridan, observed, it seems that the Europeans are, broadly speaking, unlike Australia, have got the message, and they are stepping up on in terms of defence spending and accepting that really that they've got to do more because they have been leech-like, frankly, And I can understand why many Americans really would feel that their allies have not done the right thing.
Yeah, that I think is correct. I think the United States, um, originally, certainly in the late 40s and 50s, Europe would not survive without a very protective United States.
No,
And for many years, European countries were actually more hawkish than the Americans were. Say, Germany in particular was quite hawkish in the 1950s and 60s. After all, the Soviets occupied a third of what is now Germany. And any war would be fought on German soil. So, but as Europe became richer, there's absolutely zero reason why the United States should be paying a disproportionate share of European defense. Why we should care. We should care, I think, about German security. Speaking as an American, I believe that it is in our interest. But it's also the case that it can't be more in our interest than it is in Germany's. And if the Germans really aren't serious about the alliance, well, why should we be? And if you look at what they've been spending, it's clear that and you look at their deep desire over the years for things like Nord Stream 2 and so on, even though virtually everyone in NATO told them this was bad for the alliance, it does seem clear that for many years, Germany took American security guarantees for granted and felt absolved of any real responsibility for its own defense. An alliance like that will not long survive. And I'm glad to see that the new German government seems to be moving in the right direction, though I remember that the previous government talked a lot about Zeitenwende and we're going to take responsibility and it's a new era, but ended up actually not doing very much at all. So let's wait and see. But with Asian allies, the situation I think is a bit different. One of the reasons that it is more urgent for the United States to step back a bit in Europe is because we have to step up a bit in Asia. That the challenge of China, which again, let's not forget, in Trump's mind, is largely the result of insane trade policy, which the entire American establishment endorsed for 30 years and gave China the wherewithal to cheat its way to becoming a superpower. That has now created an urgent security threat. We saw China doing drills in the last week of a blockade of Taiwan, something that could provoke the greatest international crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis or even before. And Asian allies, I think we have to give honorable mention here to Japan as well as others. Philippines have stepped forward. Australia is taking things more seriously. So we're all waking up. And hopefully we will all wake up and each realize we must do more than before, and we must take more responsibility because the problem is greater.
My own country, you've been very kind. I don't think we've stepped up anything like enough. And my listeners in Australia will know that I think, frankly, both sides of politics have been quite weak. To come up with AUKUS, Virginia-class submarines, and then a new breed, apparently, submarines for Australia in the future is a good thing. But as I speak, the reality is that governments have rescoped the shorter-term spending on defence in order to pay for AUKUS 10 years down the road, which is too late. And in the meantime, our actual capacity is in decline as I speak, which I find extraordinary in this context. And you've alluded to it in other talks that I've heard you give. The Chinese sent a very powerful warship down into our part of the world. It's never been done before, circumnavigated the country. I'd be interested in your views as to why they would have done that, what signals they were sending, and what they would have made. So far as I know, America made no public comment on it at all, and the Australian response, I'm going to say it, was not particularly impressive. What were they doing? What was the idea, and how concerned should we be?
Well, I myself would have advised the Chinese not to do it. Uh, why stir the pot? But perhaps what they were calculating was that this would simply reveal Australia's indifference to its own defense without galvanizing the Australians to do more. And that would be a very powerful signal to Australia and to other countries in the region that might look to Australia. I think it's Australia obviously cannot be a peer competitor to China, uh, and but it could do much more than it has. I'm not going to castigate Australia. I'm not, as a diplomat, I don't think I would get a good job in the Trump administration because I do like to be a little bit civil um, most of the time. But I'd say this, you know, do countries, there are very few countries in the Indo-Pacific that could play the kind of role that Australia can. Whether it is bolstering the Philippines, whether it is combating Chinese influence from New Guinea through Pacific Island nations, whether it is helping to form an integrated Quad where Japan, India, Australia, and the United States are working together. Australians have a pretty deep knowledge of the region too, and I think the United States and Australia would work together, to great mutual benefit if we were. Well, I look at what's going on in Thailand, where we've just seen Uyghurs sent back to China over Western diplomatic protests, where we're seeing throughout Southeast Asia, I think, a drift toward China that is um, dangerous for both our countries. I think we all need to be working together much more closely than we are. And we all need to be willing to do more than we have been doing. But I certainly say that in the current mood in the United States, it's a real opportunity for Australia to be a leader. That Australia is a country that Americans instinctively like, instinctively think is one of the good guys. And if we were getting stories about bigger defense budgets in Australia, Australia doing more with its neighbors to promote the common security, that would resonate. It would resonate in the ears of the Trump administration as well as in the ears of the public at large. Australia has the ability to make itself heard in Washington, but it has to have something to say if it's going to be heard.
I absolutely 100% concur. As a sixth generation Australian and who passionately believes in the country, I'm not quite sure why we've become almost indolent in the face of, frankly, the internal challenges that confront us as well as the external challenges. I'd be interested in your views on the region. Not many Australians are aware of the extent to which Japan really has stepped up in recent times. They've put their money where their mouth is, and they really have built quite an impressive military capability despite the restrictions that were placed on them and maintained passionately by the Japanese themselves for so long after the Second World War. I take it the bottom line is that Japan simply can't afford to allow Taiwan to lose its independence.
This is what I hear from sort of Japanese security officials and thinkers and if you look at a map, it's kind of clear. If you imagine that China is able to unify, I should say, with Taiwan, and presumably this would mean a retreat of U.S. naval presence back to Guam, people say. Japan could only trade with the rest of the world by China's permission. Freedom of the seas is not some principle of natural. It's not a property of the globe that you. It is maintained by navies. It is maintained by political commitments. And if the United States ceases to uphold that in and around Japan, Japan really has to ask China for permission to trade with the rest of the world, to get energy from the Middle East, to get raw materials from Southeast Asia, to ship to Europe, and so on and so forth. That permission will not come to a Japan that is aligned against China. And the Chinese know this, and the Japanese know this. So that the question of the future of Taiwan is not just the future of Taiwan, it's the future of Japan. And what I would say to people in Australia is ask yourselves, what is the future of Australia if Japan, whether it likes it or not, ends up having to align largely with China, as would, of course, South Korea in this scenario? Who are Australia's allies? Where does Australia look for security? What are the long-term prospects for Australia's genuine independence and the right of Australians to live as they choose? I think they are enormously bleak in this situation. Taiwan is a small island. It is not close geographically to Australia, but the future of that island is critical to the independence of Australia.
I agree. I make the point many times to people in Australia that if China moves in some way, mind you, it might be hard if they go for the slow boiling approach to determine at what point intervention might be needed, but that Japan simply will not ignore. It can't ignore and it won't ignore any move by the Chinese. And that presumably it's safe to say that whilst we hear all sorts of horror stories, and they are horrific, stories about the military build-up by China, that the Japanese Navy, with a surprising number of powerful warships with quite surprising reach, coupled with the Americans, would still be quite effective in giving the Chinese real pause for thought.
Yes. I've spent some time with both Japanese and American naval authorities. And while unlike Jeffrey Goldberg at the Atlantic magazine, I'm not included on the classified signal chats. I think the information that I've gotten is that we have some very capable forces, some extremely good equipment, a few technological tricks up our sleeves that the Chinese have not managed to duplicate or understand. And that, arguably, I think the reality is if the Chinese didn't know that this was a risky and difficult venture, they would have done it already. That there's no reason why a Chinese leader would hold back if he thought that the risks were minimal of advancing on Taiwan. So at the same time, it's very clear that China's objective is to change the military balance in a way that favors China and makes forcible reunification something that's eminently doable. And that they have spent billions of dollars over decades on what some call the greatest military buildup in the history of the world. Now, they're not just doing this because they like bright and shiny battleships and aircraft carriers as a scenic feature in their harbors, nor do they seriously believe that the United States or Japan or anybody else has any plans to invade mainland China. This is a completely insane idea that China needs large forces to defend itself from foreign aggression. There is really only one purpose for this military, for this sized military, and it's expansion.
Sobering and well put. And I wish people would pull their heads out of the sand and recognise that, as Lee Kuan Yew put it, no one nation in this part of the world can withstand that sort of pressure, but coupled together, we're a real problem for China. So let's go there now. How would Beijing be seeing how things are unfolding now? You know, I read one commentator who says, "Oh well, the Chinese leadership, President Xi would be delighted because the Western allies are tearing themselves apart and they want division and the weakening of the West." On the other hand, there are those who are saying, well, this is forcing other countries to step up. And then there are those who are saying, well, Beijing would be very worried by President Trump's lack of predictability, that's a problem for them. And we ought to see that in the West as a great plus. How do you think the president of China and those around him would be seeing the new regime in Washington?
Well, I think we should stop projecting our perceptions onto them.
Yeah.
And one thing is that China cares much less about U.S. relations with Europe than commentators do in the U.S. and even Australia. That it's very unlikely that if there was a conflict between China and the United States, God forbid, that Europe would play much of a role in that one way or the other. It's simply, not an issue. So what they look at much more closely is the relationships between Washington and allies and other countries in the region. And they pay a great deal of attention to U.S.-Japan relations, where I think they would note that in spite of trade tensions, the security relationship is going pretty well. They would look at U.S.-India relations because China sees India, which has an even larger population now than China does, as its greatest long-term problem in the region, though not an immediate one yet. But they see they see the Quad in the Indian Ocean as a real problem for them. They certainly look at Australia and U.S.-Australian relations. So I think the picture of American alliances are holding up better in the Indo-Pacific and American relationships than they are across the Atlantic, even with the trade problem. Trade problem is real. And the U.S. is going to have to find a trade policy that comports with an overall alliance policy. I think Australia is less exposed to that than some other countries. Our trade is of a different kind and is far less likely to fall subject to tariffs and so on. So I think Beijing is more asking itself, what does Trump want? They want to know, is his goal to make a deal with us? And if so, what kind of a deal? Or is he just inflexibly hostile to us no matter what? And if they think there's an acceptable deal to be had, they will try to find their way to that. But if they think that no matter what they do, the United States is going to oppose them with everything we have, then they'll respond differently. I think the Chinese probably lean toward the idea that Trump is not interested in settling the disputes. He's giving them mixed signals like he gives everyone. So he's giving TikTok extension after extension, though perhaps that is less a signal to China than to the young voters who supported Trump in November 2024. He's piling on these tariffs, but he's also talked about his desire to have better relations at a personal level. He's generally been respectful of Xi Jinping and has been careful not to say things, not to sort of directly insult the leadership. But the U.S.-China relationship is so complicated, and there's so many places where our interests are not aligned. And the issue of Taiwan is such a big one. It's difficult to know. If Trump were willing to offer China a bargain in which there was some way China could reunify or unify with Taiwan, well, that would be, China might be intrigued. But I'm not sure that would be a very difficult offer for the United States to make, and in my view, would be a strategic blunder of the greatest magnitude.
Terrifying thought to me.
Yeah. So China, as Trump likes to do, he has China wondering whether Trump is the best friend, their best chance to accomplish everything they wanted, or the worst enemy imaginable. And he likes to kind of put people in that situation where he removes all the comfortable guardrails and assumptions. I think because he believes that in those situations he's most likely to negotiate the outcome that he wants.
Coming, if I could, back to tariffs, they tell an interesting story because they're very uneven. Australia is seen, I think, as a reasonable friend, only 10%. Vietnam, 46%. China, a lot more. The prospect now, as I sit here, a threat that they'll go up another 50% if China doesn't stop trying to retaliate. Israel, a good friend of the United States, 17%. They're all over the place. In Australia's case, I should say, the greater worry to us is not the 10%. It's that our greatest trading partner, we run a big surplus with China, will be damaged. But why the different levels? And in particular, it does lead, in my mind, to the question of why 17% on Israel? Is there any rationale between the wildly differing rates of tariffs in your view? And the second part of that, let's come to Israel and America's relationship with Israel.
Right. Well, I mean, there are all kinds of calculations behind these different levels of tariffs, and I think it's important to remember that whatever is going on, this is an initial bargaining position rather than some sort of final permanent regime. And so the Trump administration probably paid less attention to the difference between an 11.5% and a 13.7% tariff. You know, that there's a certain amount of kind of randomness going on here. I think there's a penguin island that an uninhabited island that has a high tariff rate. One common thread is the attempt to use these tariffs to wean countries away from economic relations with China. So a country like Vietnam, which geopolitically wants and needs a good relationship with the United States as it's right next to China, has exported a great deal to the U.S. That Trump doesn't like that. But more to the point, in many of these factories, a lot of Chinese companies will set up a factory in Vietnam that simply assembles parts and stuff that were made in China and then sends the whole thing to the United States as made in Vietnam. So how much of that Vietnamese trade surplus is a Chinese trade surplus in disguise? And that concern about Chinese use of Mexico and Canada as platforms in the same assembly platforms in the same way also impacted, I think, Trump's initial approach to those countries. So there is something of a systemic attempt to wean countries away from China, the close, tighter relations with China, and forcing countries to make more of a trade-off in manufactured goods. Again, for Australia, this is not the same kind of issue. You're quite right that Chinese imports of raw materials from Australia could be impacted if China's manufacturing growth were to drop off the floor were to drop out from there. What I would say on that part, though, is that for Australia's sake as well as for America's sake, what we really want to see in China is a shift from export-oriented, state-driven growth to growth that relies on internal demand and consumption. And this would inevitably lead to a certain political loosening in China, if only because, consumers with lots of money in their pocket, they want to express themselves. They lead, they're harder to control. And for China to open up the internal economy, allow more internal investment, more freedom, is something that would reduce international tensions and reduce, America's problem. You'll never hear even Trump say America's problem is that China's GDP is too large. America's problem is that China has built an economic model that is predicated on systemic cheating and abuse of the international trade system, and that the consequences for the United States and for many other countries are bad. And furthermore, that the system itself is unstable, because in fact, when China was 2% or something of the world economy, it could grow faster than the rest of the world based on exports, and no one hardly noticed. But China is now of such a size that that growth in its exports creates economic crises in many other countries. So we're looking at China now appears to be aimed at kind of gutting the German automobile industry, which is the backbone of German manufacturing. So China, for its own sake, actually needs to change this model. If it did that, I don't see that it would reduce Chinese demand for Australian products, because the things that you're making for your domestic market also need imported raw materials. And if Chinese consumer incomes are higher, they would also presumably buy more things from the rest of the world, including quality food products from Australia, which many in China think are safer and more nourishing than some of the local produce. So I think it may be very difficult to get China to make this shift. But the shift would in the long run be good for China as well as good for China's trading partners. And I would hope that people in Beijing would start to see it that way. There is no objective reason why we are condemned to fight each other like, scorpions in a bottle. There really are other options here.
Let's hope someone's listening. Can I just come then, as we move to the end of a very interesting conversation, just briefly, your latest book, The Ark of a Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. You explore the history of American attitudes towards Israel. I'd be interested in your views. It would appear that that President Trump is very supportive, as indeed was the previous president, but that the left in America really have turned against Israel. And one commentator noted that perhaps Biden will be the last Democrat president who will be really supportive of Israel. How do you see things unfolding? It's an area where credit must go to President Trump. In his first term, his Middle Eastern policies were relatively effective. And it's quite probable that if they'd been continued, Iran would not have acted in the way that it has in recent times. Any thoughts you have on how the American relationship with Israel and more broadly the Middle East might play out under President Trump?
Well, I think one thing to bear in mind is that Israel's popularity in the United States generally declines when there's a long war with the Palestinians. And in the same way, in the 80s, when Israel invaded Lebanon, and there was the massacre of Palestinian combatants by Christian phalangists allied to the Israelis, you could see the polls reflecting very sharp declines in Israel's popularity. if we consider that the war in Gaza has gone on much longer, the level of casualties has been much higher. The remarkable thing to me is not that there has been some falling off in Israel's popularity in the United States, but actually that it's held up so well. And that President Biden ended up with a policy that was far more supportive of Israel than the left wing of his party wanted it to be. And he's been replaced by a president whose policy toward Israel is far more supportive than the far right wing of President Trump's party would like it to be. And there is this horseshoe effect people talk about where the far left and the far right tend to both hate Israel. And this is a subject I wrote about in my book, that the sort of ideological extremes in America who don't believe in America, in a sense, who don't believe that the American dream is real or that the American system works. Those people often are less sympathetic to Israel for all kinds of complicated cultural reasons. This is generally true around the world. So when I talk to, say, people in Australia, what I'll find is that, well, it's not infallible, but it's surprisingly common that people who are really strongly express a dislike of Israel and a kind of not simply an objection to one or another Israeli policies, but a kind of a visceral dislike of the country or a sense of its illegitimacy. Those people, generally speaking, are pretty suspicious of the U.S. Australian relationship. Generally speaking, aren't very fond of capitalism as a concept, and that this becomes a sort of badge of common ideology. And so, if you meet a German who thinks, what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, it's really too much and it's very sad, but we Germans, have a special responsibility. This is probably a person who also supports NATO and the Western alliance. But when you find somebody who is bitterly hostile against Israel and bitterly and sort of supportive, even say, of October 7th, that's a person that generally hates NATO, hates the United States, whether they're on the far left or the far right, and you'll find them in both camps. So we're not in this broadcast, we're not going to get to the root of this affinity, but it's very old and very deep, that there's a sense somehow, both among Americans and among many people beyond the United States, that Israel and the United States in some weird way are linked, whether it's ideologically, mythologically, theologically, that somehow the things that make America great are present in the Israeli experience too. And some would say, well, that just means they're settler state colonial enterprises. And so the Boers in South Africa, the cowboys in America, and the settlers in Europe, well, for that matter, maybe the settlers in Australia, are all engaged in the same horrible enterprise. And that's why they like each other, or that's why there's sympathy. So attitudes toward Israel can be a kind of a global litmus test.
Presumably you would reject this sort of rather simplistic and childish sort of Israel as a colonizer. We sympathize with them because we've been colonizers as well. That would not be your own view. And I come to something, maybe, just to give you a chance to say something about what you wrote in your latest book. This interested me. The belief that history is ascending toward a future of more freedom, more justice, more abundance, and higher spiritual values is one of the foundations of American thought. That's the sort of better angels, if you like, in American society that you're referring to there. And the broad question is, how alive is that spirit? Is it, in your view, something that can undergird a revitalization of America. Are you optimistic about America being able to resume again its mantle of global leadership in a way that's effective and perhaps turns back this tide of authoritarianism over time that's threatening to swamp us all?
Well, I think you're asking two distinct but related questions there. One is, do I believe that America is going to recover its sense of optimism about its own prospects and the human condition? And I believe that we will, if only because in over the 7+ decades of my life, I've seen this kind of cycle repeatedly, where we go through these times of despair or disgruntlement, and yet somehow we keep coming out of it. So I see signs of this. Certainly, I'm teaching this thing that I'm wearing on my shirt here is the emblem of the University of Florida where I'm teaching. It's not saying that I want to go back to Queensland and swim with the Crocs, but it's and our alligators actually are much less aggressive than your salties. I can tell you
Well,
that.
they're very nasty, the salties. They're very nasty.
So the young people that I teach are looking for reasons to believe, and they're looking for ways to be effective. And I think we are going to see a resurgence of that kind of American spirit. Now, about American leadership in the world, I don't think we're going to quite go back to the old system, in the sense that that was really a kind of if you think about the sweep of world history, because the Industrial Revolution happened first in Europe, it gave rise to a century and a half of sort of European domination of the world. And even in places that the European political authorities didn't control or had gained independence, there was a kind of an inner orientation, adaptation of Western models. You think of Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, or look at pictures of Ali Jinnah in Pakistan, impeccably Western dressed. I think Prime Minister Nehru once said to a visitor, he said, "I am the last Britisher to rule India." And there was they'd been educated in Western universities, largely assimilated to Western norms. When they said modernization, they meant something very similar to, say, what the Fabian socialists in Britain who were often their teachers, would have said. We are not going to have a future like that, where we all become more westernized. India is going to be more Indian than it used to be. It is going to be less and less saying, "Oh, I want to be more like Denmark." Turkey is going to not want, what good, bad, or indifferent. Turkey sees a different future for itself than it used to. Now, I think Russia, China, so many countries now are, instead of trying to follow the West on a common path, are trying to chart their own routes to a future that is more abundant, that hopefully offers more space to people to live their own lives in their own way, but which is grounded in more indigenous values. So, American leadership in a world like that is going to be somewhat different than what we saw in the post-World War II or even post-Cold War period. I do think that America's economic prowess, our sort of uniquely favorable geopolitical location, and this sort of our natural tendency to think in global rather than in regional terms, when given the structure of our interests and our trade and so on, will keep the United States active in the international system and will give us a role that is unique. But it won't be 1958 again.
Well, on that really fascinating ending, I'd like to thank you very much indeed again. The content's been gold, and I know a lot of people will be really interested to hear this.
Great. Appreciate it. It was a great interview. Thank you.
Thank you.